I'll have you, Mark, I'll have you lead us with that reading. O Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, grant that I may aspire towards thee with my whole heart, with yearning desire and with thirsting soul, seeking only thy sweetness and thy delights, so that my whole mind and all that is within me may ardently sigh to thee, who art our true beatitude. O merciful Lord, engrave thy wounds upon my heart with thy most precious blood, that I may read in them both thy grief and thy love, and that the memory of thy wounds may ever remain in my inmost heart, to excite my compassion for thy sufferings and to increase in me thy love. Grant also that I may be detached from all creatures, and that my heart may delight in thee alone. Amen. Okay, and thanks again, Mark, for being our reader tonight. Please go ahead with June 15th, 1904.
Okay. The creature is nothing but a little container filled with a dose of all the divine particles. As I was in my usual state, he came for just a little and told me, "My beloved daughter, the creature is so dear to me, and I love her so much that if the creature could comprehend it, her heart would burst with love. This is so true that in creating her, I made her as nothing but a little container filled with a dose of all the divine particles in such a way that all my being, attributes, virtues, perfections, the soul contains many little particles according to the capacity given to her by me, and this so that I might find in her as many little notes corresponding to my notes, and thus be able to delight perfectly and to play with her. Now, when the soul deals with material things and lets them enter into this little container filled with the divine, something of the divine flows outside of it, and something of matter enters to take its place. What affront the divinity receives, and what harm for the soul. How much attention it takes so as not to let material things enter inside, if by necessity she has to deal with them. You, my daughter, be attentive. Otherwise, if I see anything which is not divine in you, I will not make myself seen anymore."
So I wrote at the top of this passage, why don't we see Jesus? And it's because we can be so filled with things that don't matter, don't last. And certainly sin does that, but wanting those divine particles, the divine life that he created us with, which is the very essence of our existence, little particles of divine life and his goodness, little bits of his attributes, as much as is possible for tiny little creatures like us, because he created us in his image and likeness. But when we take more and more of the world and more of the things that don't last and make them a priority or consume an awful lot of our time, even our pursuits, then it's like taking, if you were to have a container and it was half full of oil, and then you started pouring a full pitcher of water into the container, pretty soon you have no oil in the container. And so he doesn't want us to be filled up with the things of the world, with self-interest, with pursuits that don't matter. He wants us to be filled more and more with his life. And the more that we surrender our will to his will, he does in reality reach into our soul and expand our capacity so that he can put more of his life, more of his goodness, more of his love into each of us. And that's why the church has always understood that souls that get to heaven, they don't all have the exact same level in their capacity of joy. It depends entirely on how we live here on earth. In fact, that's before we opened the recording, there was a brief sharing related to purgatory. And In purgatory, so once a person crosses the threshold we call death and they enter eternity, there's no more changing their eternal destiny. They certainly can have the voids of their soul filled with love in purgatory, but they don't gain more merit. Their capacity for joy in eternity will not be expanded. We're in the testing grounds here. This is the time when we can be filled with grace and be instruments of helping others be filled with grace as well, coming to know the truth and wanting to live the truth in such a way that their place in heaven is being prepared and increased at the level of their response. The more that we strive to live the will of God, the more he is delighted to give us a greater share in his goods. Okay, go ahead.
June 17th, 1904. The consummation of the human will in the divine renders the soul one with God and places the divine power in her hands. This morning, after I struggled very much, blessed Jesus came and told me, "My daughter, see how many things are said about virtue, about perfection, but they all end up in one single point, that is, the consummation of the human will in the divine. So the more one is consumed in it, the more it can be said that he contains everything and is more perfect than everyone. In fact, all virtues and good works are many keys that open the divine treasures and makes one acquire more friendship, more intimacy, more commerce with God. But consummation alone is what renders the soul one with him and places the divine power in her hands. And this, because life must have a will in order to live, and by living of the divine will, one naturally takes up ownership."
So this passage is along the same lines as what we just heard for June 15th. He says, all end up in one single point, the consummation of the human will in the divine will. And really, all spiritualities, all movements that are truly good and faithful to the fullness of Catholicism, they all lead to the reign of the divine will in souls. It's interesting to see how people, we're in volume 6. It's interesting to see how many people who start reading consistently. And I have to point out, I hope that everybody that's joining us on Friday nights are way ahead of where we are, because to really understand how important this is, to want to grow in the understanding, the knowledge, and to move towards to receive the gift of the divine will, not just the invitation of the divine will to animate our actions, as important as that is, but to strive towards living only and always in the will of God. That takes reading constantly, at least a passage a day. If you have a super tight schedule, at least a page from the passages a day. So it doesn't work very well if once a week, and you're all welcome to join us if this is all that you do, but it's not going to do as much as it could for you if once a week you open the volumes, you read along with us, and then you close them and don't touch them again until the next meeting. And I don't think that many are doing that, but I encourage everyone that has any of the volumes to be reading every day, because they're seeds of light that open our attentiveness to what he's offering. And the more that I see people do that with the passages, with the various volumes, the more I see them recognizing when they hear the scriptures at Mass, when they're reading the scriptures at home, when they're reading the lives of the saints, when they're reading any good inspirational material, they start to realize everything sounds like it's about the divine will. Well, that's because all paths lead to the reign of the divine will in souls. For 2,000 years, the Lord has been getting the world ready for what we're privileged to be able to study. The scriptures that were written 2,000 years ago, approximately, a little bit less, if you read them with the light of what you're learning from the passages of Luis's writings, you see the divine will everywhere. You can be at Mass, and in fact, the first time that I opened up to the writings of Luisa, I had just heard about the divine will, and I attended a daily mass in my own parish. A substitute priest came. He started his homily, and he was quite advanced in years. As I became aware after I talked to him, almost starting stages of dementia, but still able to celebrate Mass. His homily was all about the divine will. He used the term divine will over and over again in his homily. And so I found out where he was. I gave him a phone call the next day where he was in residence. And I asked him, Father, how did you hear about the divine will? He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, yesterday you were up at St. John's in Encinitas, and your homily went on and on about the divine will. I had just started reading about the divine will myself. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, you spoke about the divine will. He said, I don't remember saying anything about the divine will. But the Lord wanted me to hear this priest talking about the divine will so that I would ease up and take it more seriously, not have any reservations, but really want to find out what it was about. And so I encourage all of us to be reading every day, because all roads lead to the divine will, and the more that we read the passages, the more we'll recognize that. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
June 19th, 1904. Sorrowful times for the church, the glory of the athletic spirits. As I was in my usual state, I felt my adorable Jesus near me, saying, my daughter, what a sorrowful stage the church is about to enter. But all the glory in these times is of those athletic spirits who, heedless of shackles, chains, and pains, do nothing but break the thorny path that divides the society from God. Then he added, one can see greed for human blood in man, he from the earth, and I will concur from heaven with earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, calamities, such as to make a good part of them die.
So we could look at that and say, well, this was in 1904. That must have been something that only happened within the next 5 to 10 years. But with the Lord who is eternal, when he says in a short time or is about to happen, he can definitely be speaking about our time. In fact, the more that we read, the more that we'll see that what he was saying back then applies directly to what's happening in our time. And so what is he saying to us in this short passage? That he wants us to be athletes. He wants us to break through the chains, tramp down the brambles, in his will, not let anything hold us back, not be filled with fear, not bow to authorities that want to manipulate us or oppress us. And we need to be inviting the divine will into all of our efforts to live faithfully and consistently, not cowering based on the treatment or ridicule. Right now, it's just ridicule if we take a stand for the truth. And so we need to be athletes. How do athletes succeed? Exercising regularly, daily. Think about the Olympic athletes. They spend their whole lives, hours and hours, day after day, for years, to be able to be powerful, effective, and hopefully winning athletes. Well, the Lord is asking us to be athletes. Go ahead.
June 20th, 1904. Victim souls are the daughters of mercy. After I struggled very much, Blessed Jesus came for just a little and told me, my daughter, human perfidy has reached such a point as to exhaust my mercy on its part. But my goodness is so great as to constitute daughters of mercy, so that on the part of creatures also, this attribute may not be exhausted. These are the victims who are in full ownership of the divine will, having destroyed their own. In fact, in these souls, the container given by me in creating them is in full vigor, and since they have received the particle of my mercy, being daughters, they administer it to others. It is understood, however, that in order to be able to administer the particle of my mercy to others, they themselves must be justice. And I, Lord, who can ever be in justice? And he, one who does not commit grave sins and abstains from committing the slightest venial sins of his own will.
He just gave us the formula. And so the battle is to renounce our willfulness, our preferences, even in the little things, so that his will can reign in us. And, while Luisa was definitely a high level victim, stigmatized, suffering constantly, any kind of dying to self is, for us, especially if we become so accustomed to comfort and pleasure and amusements. I'm talking about licit pleasures, but if we become so accustomed to that we think we're doing the Lord a favor by setting aside a little time now, a little time later for prayer, or we get so caught up in all the stuff going on the media, or spending hours and hours sending stuff everywhere, which really can consume hours and hours on the part of other people who read everything that we send. And some things I think are necessary for us to share, but we can certainly go overboard with that. And so we have to be careful. But what he's telling us is, in order to be able to administer the particle of my mercy, the justice, and I've mentioned this many times in homilies, when we ask for justice, a lot of times we think we've been mistreated, or we think other people have been mistreated. And we should have a heart for those who have not been treated well, or are being brutalized, like what's going on in various places in the world today. But the first order of justice is to give God his due. And that's our whole being. We are to love the Lord our God with our whole heart, whole mind, whole soul, and all our strength. And Jesus says that's the first and greatest commandment. Then he said we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so justice, rightly ordered, is giving God his due. And that means not taking even the smallest, he says here, one who does not commit grave sins and abstains from committing the slightest venial sins of his own will. And so we have to strive for that perfection, knowing that he alone can bring us to perfection. But if we don't make the effort, he has nothing to work with. And so all of those little sacrifices, big as they may feel to us, are little victimhoods, little self-offerings, so that he can give us more of those particles that we may have displaced with choices of the past, so he can fill us up with divine life, his own likeness. Go ahead.
June 29th, 1904. The sign to know when God withdraws from the soul. This morning, as I was in my usual state, my adorable Jesus made himself seen for just a little and told me, my daughter, the sign to know when my justice can no longer bear man and is in the act of sending grave chastisements is that man can no longer bear himself. In fact, rejected by man, God withdraws from him and makes him feel all the weight of his nature, of sin, of miseries, and man, unable to bear the weight of his nature without divine help, seeks himself, the way to destroy himself. Such is the state the present generation is now in.
And that present generation is more now in than then, I think. You don't have to look too far to see that this is happening everywhere. Grave chastisements, it's like it's one after another, or chastisements simultaneously in different parts of the world. We have a multiplicity of suicides, and we have loads of young people threatening their own parents that they're going to commit suicide if they don't get to do the most insane things to themselves, or in their behaviors, or in their choices. And insane in that it is so destructive, self-destructive, so much caught up in the confusion of the world. And so these are grave chastisements. And what's the response for people like us who are gaining the truth, not just about living the faith, but applying principles in the divine will for the sake of all, past, present, and future? We have a very important role at this time in human history. Go ahead.
July 14th, 1904. Life is a continuous consummation. My days are becoming more and more sorrowful because of the almost continuous privations of my adorable Jesus. I myself do not know why I feel my soul and also my body being devoured by this separation. What a consuming torment! My only and sole comfort is the will of God, because if I have lost everything, and also Jesus, this holy and most sweet will of God alone is my power. Also, feeling that my body too is being devoured, I flatter myself that it will not take too long for it to melt, because I see that I feel it succumb, and therefore I hope that one day or another the Lord may call me to himself and end this hard separation.
Keep going.
Then, this morning, after much struggling, oh, how much, he came for just a little and told me, my daughter, life is a continuous consummation. Some consume it for pleasures, some for creatures, some for sinning, others for interests, some for whims. There are many kinds of consummation. Now, one who forms this consummation, all in God, can say with all certainty, Lord, my life has been consumed with love for you, and I have not only consumed myself, but I have died for love of you alone. Therefore, if you feel yourself being consumed continuously because of my separation, you can say that you are dying continuously in me, and that you suffer many deaths for love of me. And if you consume your being for me, as great as the consummation of yourself is, so much do you acquire the divine within yourself.
I had a priest one time say to me, we're dying, and that's a fact. With every day, we're closer to our last day. And we could think of that as being a very morbid thought, or we could look at it the way Louisa or Saint Faustina and many other saints didn't want to waste a moment of their lives. They saw that every moment of living here on earth was a gift with which they could gain graces for themselves, gain merit, and for others. That everything could be a type of productive life, all for the greater and honor and glory of God. So I wrote at the bottom of this paragraph, in what way and for what are we spending, consuming our heartbeats, our breaths, our thoughts, our movements, our glances, our talents, our listening, our feelings, our senses, and our prayers? We're spending them, or we're, in the case of virtuous acts, maybe neglecting them. And so Jesus gives the example just below the beginning of the second paragraph. He says, my daughter, life is a continuous consummation. So for every heartbeat, that's one beat less we'll have in the progression towards the day that we cross the threshold. Some consume it for pleasures, which will do nothing for our eternity. Some for creatures, and that could be good or not. Some for sinning. May God have mercy on us all for the wrong choices we have made. Others for interests. May God have mercy on us for the so many things that we spend a lot of time and attention that does not have anything to do with God. Some for whims, and that would be even more serious. Now, everything, interests, even illicit pleasures, if they're in a communion with the Lord, offering the enjoyment or the participation for his honor and glory, and to give him praise and thanks for, when you have a good meal and you enjoy the flavor of the meal, you can be in a communion with him, knowing that the very nutrition that you're gaining is because he's willing it, and the pleasure of enjoying that meal is because of his love for us. So you can be in a communion in a lot of the normal daily activities, human activities, that is not empty, but is really ordered towards God with love and appreciation. But if it's just for the sake of doing it or enjoying it, it has nothing to do with the Lord, it's a consummation that's of that period of life that's empty. And so what he's telling us is He wants us to be in union with him in all that we say and do, and to be avoiding anything that would deplete those particles of divine life. Okay, go ahead.
July 22nd, 1904. Only stability is what reveals the progress of divine life within the soul. Continuing in my usual state, Blessed Jesus came for just a little and told me, my daughter, when the soul proposes either not to sin or to do some good and does not carry out the proposition she made, it is a sign that those things are not done with all of her will and that the divine light has had no contact with the soul. In fact, when her will is true and the divine light makes known to her the evil to be avoided or the good to be done, the soul hardly fails to execute what she has proposed. On the other hand, when the divine light does not see stability in her will, it does not administer to her the necessary light in order to avoid something or to do something else. At the most, there might be moments of misfortune, abandonments by creatures, or some other circumstance, such that it seems that the soul would want to undo herself for God and change life. But as soon as the wind of the circumstances changes, immediately her human will changes. So instead of will and light, it can be said that there is a mixture of passions according to the changes in the winds. Stability alone is what reveals the progress of divine life within the soul, because since God is immutable, one who possesses him shares in his immutability in good.
So God never changes, and he wants for the souls that strive to live only and always his will, that we would be unchanging as well. There would be the stability. I'm not saying that because I think I have that all together. It's a challenge for us. These lessons call for a high level of response so that he can move us to a high level of sanctity. And we can recognize in our lives that we aren't perfect yet. I certainly have to face that. And so recognizing the call, the ideal, should inspire us to keep trying and keep acknowledging with humility our need for him to accomplish every good in us. And the Blessed Mother and the Virgin in the kingdom of the divine will, she says that the human will is weak, inconstant, vacillating, and prone to evil. That's the package of the human will that is not totally and consistently sacrificed to the reign of the divine will. So he alone can bring us to a place where there's strength, divine strength, where that inconstancy becomes a stability. He alone can bring that about, but we have to bring him the intention. You know, I am the chaplain for Courage and Encourage, and we use the 12-step program. There's a lot of different 12-step, which actually came from Alcoholics Anonymous, I think, but they use it for overeating, for drugs, for a lot of different habitual patterns that need to be broken. And in the 12 steps, regardless of what the focus or the freedom that they're looking for, it's always taking one day at a time. And for us, studying the divine will, we should try taking certainly a day at a time, but maybe an hour at a time, or a segment of the day at a time, and work for that stability of wanting to be in union with the Lord. What I found was helpful for me was to, nowadays I have watches that do all kinds of things that I'm not up on, but I had a watch that I thought was pretty neat years ago, and you could set it to beep every hour. Now they're doing a lot more than that, but I would set it to beep to remind me, in case I had forgotten, to again refresh the invitation of the divine will to reign in me. And you can find your own stimuli for refreshing the decision to strive for that stability. Okay, go ahead.
July 27th, 1904. For one who truly loves God, all things are divine will. Everything must be sealed by love. As I was in my usual state, my adorable Jesus came out from within my interior, and holding up my head, for I was very tired because of the long time waiting for him, he told me, my daughter, one who truly loves me in anything that happens to her, internal and external, devours everything as one single thing, which is the divine will. Of all things, none seems strange to her, and she looks at it as a product of the divine will. Therefore, she consumes everything in it. So her center, her aim, is only and solely the will of God. She always goes around within it as though inside a ring, without ever finding the way out, and making of it her continuous food. Having said this, he disappeared.
Go ahead.
Later, as he came back, he told me, "Daughter, let everything in you be sealed by love. If you think, you must only think of love. If you speak, if you work, if you palpitate, if you desire, if even just one desire which is not love comes out of you, restrict it within yourself, convert it into love, and then give it the freedom to go out." And while saying this, he seemed to be touching my whole person with his hand, placing many seals of love.
We can ask him to fill us with his divine love. And the more that we ask that, the more that he's happy to give us portions of his divine love to enable us to love with his own love. He deserves to be loved with his own love. I've mentioned many times, this is what Benedict Pope Emeritus during his papacy was saying, that the Lord was trying to move us to that place, especially the church. When St. John Paul said that the church would be learning to worship in a divine manner, he was talking specifically about the divine will reigning in us and certainly in our worship, but then making everything that we do an act of worship. Even the illicit pleasures. When we get to volume 7, we don't need to jump ahead, but when we get to that point, he talks about how everything is ordered by him for our good. And so pleasures and disappointments, hardships and joys, all of that, if the divine will is the animator, if we recognize it as having been prepared for us so that we can be in communion with him, the reality of this passage that we just had becomes more constant. That's what he wants for us. Go ahead.
July 28th, 1904. The soul who is detached from everything finds God in all things. This morning, as I was in my usual state, Blessed Jesus came for a little while and told me, "My daughter, when the soul is detached from everything, in all things she finds God. She finds him within herself. She finds him outside of herself. She finds him in creatures." So it can be said that for the soul who is completely detached, all things convert into God. Even more, she not only finds him, but contemplates him, feels him, embraces him, and since she finds him in everything, all things administer to her the occasion to adore him, to pray him, to thank him, to draw close to him more intimately. And besides, your laments about my privation are not completely reasonable. If you feel me in your interior, it is a sign that I am not only outside of you, but also inside, as though in my own center.
Go ahead.
I forgot to say at the beginning that my Queen Mama brought him to me, and since I was praying him to content me and not to leave me without himself, Blessed Jesus answered the way written above.
So it was with the help of the Blessed Mother that she received this instruction. And so the instruction is for us as well. And we can ask the Blessed Mother to help us take it to heart, even as Louisa did. We hear Jesus saying, even more, she not only finds him, this is a soul that's striving to be detached from everything in order to find God in everything. That might sound like a contradiction, but the more that we cling to the things, relationships or worldly things, the more we miss the fact that they exist because of God and because of God for our good. I've told the story many times that I heard before the Blessed Sacrament, the Lord say, "My will is within you." and when I was seeking his will. And then a little passage from Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta that said, the will of God for you is to recognize it within you and all around you unfolding. So the magnificence of God's plan that is perfect for us within us and all around us. And if we are detached from the things of the world in such a way that they're not our goal, they're not our primary focus, we go about our duties. There's no sanctity without duties, the Blessed Mother says. But as duties to glorify God, not as goals or rewards in and of themselves, then we can, our hearts and minds are open to recognizing his providential care in everything. And that will prepare us to, the more that we strive to live that way, the more that we'll recognize his hand in everything. It's delightful when somebody has a praise report where they have a particular question they raise to the Lord in prayer, and then the next time they open the scriptures, or when they hear a homily at church, or they're talking with a friend, and they get an answer to the question that they raised before God in prayer. And that's just one example. There's so many ways that the Lord is showing his love and speaking to us in all of creation. So this is not a reference that could be seen as polytheism. It's nothing exists outside of God's sustaining it, and he doesn't sustain it just for the sake of its sustenance. He sustains it having created it for us. So there's to be a communion with us in every detail of our lives. This is what he wants for us, and this is where we'll find the greatest joy in recognizing his hand in all things because of his love for us.
July 29th, 1904. Faith makes one known God, but trust makes him find him. Continuing in my usual state, as soon as I saw my adorable Jesus, I said to him, my Lord and my God. And he continued, God, God, God alone. Daughter, faith makes one know God, but trust makes one find him. So, without trust, faith is sterile. And even though faith possesses immense riches with which the soul can enrich herself, if there is no trust, she remains always poor and lacking in everything. While he was saying this, I felt myself being drawn into God. I remained absorbed in him, like a little drop of water in the immense sea. As much as I looked, I could find no boundaries, either of height or of breadth. Heaven and earth, blessed and pilgrim souls, all were immersed in God. I could also see wars, like that between Russia and Japan, and the thousands of soldiers who were dying and will die, and that by justice, also natural, the victory will be of Japan. And I saw that other European nations were plotting machinations of war, even against nations of Europe. But who can say all that I could see of God and in God? So, to end it, I stop here.
So the Lord was giving her to know things that she could not have known otherwise. But he's talking to her, and so he's talking to us about trust. Obviously, he points out faith is good, but it doesn't bear fruit. It's sterile if we don't put all of our trust in him. With all that's going on in the world today, the question is, are we putting all of our trust in him, or are we constantly unsettled? Are we filled with fear or anger, resentment, bitterness, suspicion of the people that are pawns in this battle? If we place all our trust in him, then we'll keep our prayers going, knowing that he is orchestrating everything for our good, including the chastisements. He loves us all and he wants us with him, and he'll do whatever is necessary to have more and more souls turning to him, at least before they pass. And it's our part to be inviting the divine will into all of our actions, all of our prayers, all of our little sacrifices, to appeal to him as if all souls were appealing to him for the reign of his will on earth as in heaven. Go ahead.
July 30th, 1904. The detachment that priests must have. This morning, Blessed Jesus was not coming, and I, finding myself outside of myself, went round and round in search of my highest and only good. Not finding him, my soul felt itself dying at each instant. But what increased my torment was that while I felt I was dying, I would not die, for if I could die, I would reach my intent to be forever in the center of God. Oh, separation, how bitter and painful you are. There is no pain that can be compared to you. Oh, divine privation, you consume, you pierce. You are a two-edged sword that cuts on one side and burns on the other. The pain you give is immense as is God. Now, while wandering about, I found myself in purgatory, and my sorrow and my crying seemed to increase the sorrow of those poor souls deprived of their life, God. Among them, there seemed to be quite a few priests, one of whom seemed to be suffering more than the others. And he said to me, my grave sufferings come from the fact that in life I was very attached to family interests, to earthly things, and I had little attachment to some people. This produces so much evil for the priest as to form an iron shell covered with mud that enwraps him like a garment, and only the fire of purgatory and the fire of the privation of God, which is that compared to it, the first fire disappears, can destroy the shell. Oh, how much I suffer. My pains are unutterable. Pray, pray for me. I felt even more tormented, and I found myself inside of myself.
And
Later,
so we have that, prayer for priests. If anybody did not receive it and would like to have it, send me an email and I'd be happy to send it as an attachment. We don't pray it at every single meeting. We probably should. I definitely need to. And it's kind of frightening. We have no idea the consequences for priests like myself that will, if we make it to purgatory, will be, according to a nun's unpublished manuscript. I don't know if it's still available on the web. It was years ago, and she was given mystical encounters, and it was priests and nuns who were the deepest level of purgatory and received the least benefit of the prayers that were prayed for them because of the great gift and responsibility that's given to priests and consecrated religious. That's not to say that we should be neglectful of prayer for them, because in reality, we need to pray more for them. When I pass, I hope there's plenty of masses being celebrated for me, and I'm not saying that lightheartedly. I'm saying that with sincerity, because priests will need, all the priests in purgatory will need a great deal of merit sacrifices. On Thursdays, if you've noticed on our website, almost every Thursday, one of the two masses that I celebrate will be for the sanctification of priests. If special requests come in for the particular day of the week, a Thursday, it usually shows up somewhere else in the course of the week, or it's a private mass that's celebrated. We need to be praying for the sanctification of priests. And as I mentioned earlier in the meeting, that's the Pope and all the way down to little guys like myself. And the more responsibility they have, the more critical it is that we pray for God's mercy and forgiveness and graces of conversion. There's no soul, including the popes, that is beyond the need for more conversion and grace of sanctification. So please keep that in mind. Okay, we move on.
later, I saw just a shadow of Blessed Jesus, and he told me, my daughter, what were you searching for? For you, there is no other reliefs and helps but me alone. And he disappeared like a flash. And I was left saying, ah, he He himself tells me this, that he alone is everything for me, and yet he has the courage to leave me without deprived of him.
And so this deprivation, this privation that you referred to earlier, and the very suffering that is so extreme in purgatory, it's the privation that they experience having seen the Lord and now knowing that they're not ready to be with him in the beatific vision is their agony. And she's given this agony throughout her life, this privation, having seen him and then being deprived of seeing him, which she says is more painful than the stigmatization that she suffers. Okay, go ahead.
July 31st, 1904. The human will falsifies and profanes even the holiest works. Continuing in my poor state, it seemed that he came more than once, and I seemed to see him as a child, as though surrounded by a shadow. He said to me, "My daughter, don't you feel the freshness of my shadow? Rest in it, for you will find refreshment." And it seemed that we rested together in his shadow, and I felt all reinvigorated, being close to him. Then he continued, "My beloved, if you love me, I do not want you to look either inside or outside of yourself, at whether you are warm or cold, at whether you do much or little, or at whether you suffer or enjoy. All this must be destroyed in you. You must have your eyes fixed only on whether you do as much as you can for me, and everything to please me. The other ways, as high, sublime, and industrious as they might be, cannot please me and content my love. Oh, how many souls falsify true devotion and profane the holiest works with their own will, always seeking themselves, even in holy things. If one seeks her will, her own way, and taste of the satisfaction of herself, if she finds herself, she escapes from God and does not find him.
So we have him saying, you must have your eyes fixed only on whether you do as much as you can for me. Because he starts out by saying, not to be looking outside or inside, but in the previous passage, we had him saying that he wants her, and so us, to find him inside our interior and outside in everything else around us. And so he doesn't want us distracted with a gaze that's fixed on the things or the conditions or the persons inside our own emotions or outside in the world as a primary focus. And so this detachment can be recognized if there's a pursuit of self-satisfaction, a self-centeredness, a focus on what's in it for me or what is this going to cost me. A lot of times when people are thinking about responding more wholeheartedly, there's a hesitation with well, I don't know, what's this going to cost me? Even religious preferences can get in the way of this total surrender to the will of God. I remember one time I was flown into Arizona to give a divine will weekend, and they took me to speak to a lady that was, they thought, just perfect to learn about the divine will. She was very much involved in a lot of different things in her parish and different devotional prayers, and so they had appealed to her to let me come and talk to her for a little bit. And as soon as I sat down and started to share with her about Luisa's writings and the gift of the divine will, her face became contorted with anger. And she said, "Don't you understand? I already have my own spirituality. I don't need anybody telling me anything else." And so that was that religious preference. Now, I don't think that she realized that she was saying she didn't want to know anything about the divine will. It's just that she already was rooted in preferences and wasn't about to make any changes. Other religious preferences can be the benefits that we get by certain prayers. The Lord knows, heaven knows, Blessed Mother knows that we are benefits oriented. And so a lot of times the novenas and the different prayer practices are attached to the benefits and blessings that we can obtain. Now, that's not sin, but it's not surrender to the will of God. So we have to be careful. We can certainly do devotional prayers that have lots of benefits, graces, and blessings as an aside. But most importantly is the reign of God's will in us, not what we're going to get out of a series of practices or days of prayer. So do your novenas, say your favored prayers that were gained through different mystics, Divine Mercy Chaplet, rosaries. Those are all good. But our motives, our preferences that are connected to them can reduce the full value. If it's all about a total surrender to the will of God and there's no contingencies, no, I'm going to pray this rosary because I want such and such. How about praying the rosary for the fulfillment of the will of God in you and all souls? That leaves nobody out. I think we have time for maybe one more.
August 4th, 1904. The state of the blessed in heaven will be according to the ways in which they comported themselves with God on earth. From the very way God is for the soul, it can be seen how the soul is for God. This morning, when blessed Jesus came, he transported me outside of myself, and taking me by the hand, he led me as far as underneath the vault of the heavens, from where one could see the blessed and hear their chanting. Oh, how the blessed were swimming in God. One could see their lives in God, and the life of God in them. This alone seems to me to be the whole essence of their happiness. It also seems to me that each blessed is a new heaven, and that the blessed dwelling, but all distinct among themselves. There is no one similar to anyone else, and this happens according to the ways in which they comported themselves with God on earth. One tried to love him more. You will love him more in heaven, and will receive from God ever new and increasing love in such a way that this heaven will have a divine shade and feature, all special. Another tried to glorify him more, and bless God will give him ever increasing glory in such a way that this new heaven will be more glorious and glorified by the very divine glory. And so with all the other distinct ways that each one had with God on earth, such that if I wanted to say everything, excuse me, I would be too long. So it can be said that what we do for God on earth, we shall continue in heaven, but with greater perfection. Therefore, the good we do is not temporary, but will last for eternity and will shine before God and around us continuously.
Keep going.
Oh, how happy we will be in seeing that all our good and the glory we give to God, as well as our own, comes from that little bit of good that we started imperfectly on earth. If all could see this, oh, how they would hasten more to love, to praise, to thank, and other things the Lord, so as to be able to do it with greater intensity in heaven. But who can say everything? Rather, it seems to me that I am speaking much nonsense about the blessed dwelling place. My mind has it in one way, but my mouth cannot find the words to manifest it. Therefore, I move on.
So she's making it clear that what has been given to her to understand, especially in volume 17, there's other places as well, where she is asked to describe the ways that the Lord communicates with her. And there's various ways. And so this is infused knowledge. It's light that's transmitted to her with an understanding that she doesn't have many words to describe. So that's why she's calling it nonsense. It's not in any way being disrespectful of the great gifts and understanding that the Lord is granting her. but she feels like it's nonsense in comparison to what has been shown to her as she tries to put it into words. If all could see this, she says, oh, how they would hasten to move to love him more. And that should be something that we ask for, a grace to be consistent and perseverant in loving him more. Because earlier in the same passage, the more that we strive to love him, the more he will grant that capacity in heaven. Okay, go ahead.
Then afterwards, he transported me to earth. Oh, how horrifying are the troubles of the earth in these sad times. Yet it seems that this is still nothing compared to what will come, both in the religious state, so much so that it seems that the church, this good and holy mother, will be torn to shreds by her very children, and in the secular state. Then after this, he took me back into myself and told me, tell me a little bit, my daughter, how I am for you. And I, everything you are, everything for me. Nothing enters into me. Everything flows outside, but you alone. And he, and I am all for you. Nothing of you goes out of me, but I delight all of myself in you. So, from the very way I am for you, you can see how you are for me. Having said this, he disappeared.
So this is prophetic. Oh, how horrifying are the troubles of the earth in these sad times. Yet it seems that this is still nothing compared to what will come, both in the religious state, so much so that it seems that the church, this good and holy mother, will be torn to shreds by her very children. And so we are fortunate to live in these times and being offered the tools, divine participation for a church that is reeling in pain and division. And the saddest thing is that the good and holy bishops that are trying to help the church stay stable have to also strive not to cause a greater division in the church, because polarization is so strongly accomplished already and on the part of some church leaders. So if those who are trying to call us to a stability take an adversarial role loudly and publicly, it just fosters the division at a faster pace. So we pray for those who are suffering greatly in the way of church leadership and trying to know how to guide the flock and not foment the division any further, while at the same time encouraging people to live by their consciences and have well-formed consciences, not just as it relates to vaccines, but in every regard. The church is really suffering greatly. I think about when that book that I mentioned, A Church in Crisis, was first selling very rapidly. One of the afternoon addresses was an attack on anybody who would say that the church was in crisis. I don't think we have to look too far to see that it is, in fact, in a crisis and is dependent upon the sacrifices of those who understand that the Lord wants a mending of the confused souls, and for the divine will to reign in as many souls on earth as possible in these difficult times. And so we pray. We'll close with prayer. Let me pull up our closing prayer. Thank you, Mark, for being our reader tonight. You always do a great job. And I'm going to use the prayer to the Immaculate Mary, asking her to help us in these difficult times. I hope you'll all join me as we turn to her. Immaculate Mary, give me the grace to annihilate my will before the will of your divine Son, so that the will of your divine Son be mine. Kindle my heart with divine love. See to it that the purest flame of God's love penetrate deeply in my spirit and rout out my selfishness. Give me a tender devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and your holy love, in order that I love you as you deserve. Help me detach perfectly from everything, creatures and myself, renouncing myself and everything to live only in God. My tender mother, obtain for me a deep humility from God, internal and external humility, a deep knowledge of myself, and a spirit of mortification, so that I humble myself before God and creatures. Help me to have contempts and humiliations loved, but myself despised. Mirror of humility, grant me the virtue of humility and obedience. Grant me the virtue of meekness and sweetness, so that I treat people with kindness, especially when I meet the ones against whom I feel repugnance. Give me a simple, merry, sweet, gentle, kind, benign, compassionate, humble, and meek heart. Impetrate for me a profound contrition and intimate sorrow, to make my heart bleed for my offenses against your divine Son. Grant me a spirit of holy prayer, the grace of meditating upon the sublime truths of faith, especially the passion of Jesus and your sorrows. Give me the grace of praying in the occasions of sin. Grant me a holy recollection, the grace of being aware of your holy presence, and the virtue of silence. Grant me from God the holy virtue of spiritual and bodily purity, as well as purity of conscience through humble, frequent, and sincere confession for the greater glory of God. Obtain for me a heroic faith, along with a loving filial confidence in the most sacred heart of Jesus and in your motherly affection. Grant me fervent zeal for the glory of God and the salvation of souls. Let me perform the duties of my vocation perfectly. See to it that I pray the holy sacrifice of the Mass and all my prayers with deep recollection and intimate devotion. My tender mother, give me the virtue of fortitude to prevail over myself through internal and external mortification. O valiant lady, you have conquered hell. Give me strength to triumph over the devil, the world, and the flesh. You are our life and hope. Please grant me holy, final perseverance in the grace of your divine Son. See to it that I live and die saintly and love you in paradise forever. Amen. Well, that's all the time that we have for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope that those who are able, within relatively close proximity, decent driving time, can join us on September 4th for our Divine Will Day of Prayer and first Saturday devotions. Hope to see you again next week, which will be right before that day of prayer. God bless you all.